Before dawn, Dragonstone was a black rib lifting out of the sea, slick with salt and old ash. And the wind that moved across the island smelled of whetstone and kelp, and fires long fallen to cinder. Jon stood at the edge of the high causeway where the dragon skulls carved into parapets had eyes that never blinked, and the surf below pulled at the basalt like the ocean gnawing a bone. He had slept little. Sleep, when it came, fractured into the same few images that refused to fade. The flash of green over the bay when wildfire had burned his brother on a river of iron, the droop of a gray head beneath a sword in a snowy courtyard, a girl whispering a northern god's name through split lips. Sometimes he woke with the taste of smoke in his mouth, though no fire burned near him. Drogon lay further down the slope on a bench of rock that had warmed all night under his mass. His flanks rose and fell like bellows, and when he exhaled a curl of steam, it hung in the cold air and drifted away as if deciding where to become cloud. The dragon's eyes, filmed by their second lids, slid open and closed with the slow disdain of a creature that had long since accepted the world for what it was and intended to master it anyway. He did not sleep like horses slept, with one ear always and forever listening. Drogon's rest was a deeper, slower thing, the rest of coiled potential. Jon watched him the way he had watched Ghost as a pup, wondering at the strangeness and the closeness, the sense that some living thing had chosen him without any prayer or plan to guide it. Bootsteps scraped behind him. Tyrion made a performance of adjusting his cloak against the wind. His hair had grown drier and thinner in the weeks since, as if worry itself ate color. He had drunk less wine of late, and looked both better and worse for it. "Your queen has not eaten," he said without greeting. "I am told that means battle is near or despair, and I prefer my calamities preceded by some whisper of sugar. I had the cook sweeten the porridge and she refused it." Jon did not turn from the sea. The Iron Fleet lay somewhere beyond that hard line where water met sky. A darker darkness waiting for light. Does she sleep? Not so much. She sits with the fire and stares into it as if it will take dictation. Tyrion's breath smoked. "You did not sleep, either. You Northerners consider that virtue, I'm told." "It's habit," Jon said. "Sometimes habit keeps you alive, and sometimes it kills you by inches." Tyrion produced a small skin from within his cloak and took a careful sip. He grimaced. "It is only water," he promised. "I am striving to keep my wits entirely my own, at least until late afternoon." The waves struck the rocks, caged white animals trying to escape. Jon had tried to pray the night before and found the words stiff in his mouth, as if the gods he had known were far from seas and black stone and the heat of dragons. He had never been at home anywhere bright. He did not know if that made him loyal to the dark, or simply in need of a different light. "You told her the bells could ring," he said. "You told her the city would yield if the scorpions were broken." "I did. I tell all manner of things to all manner of monarchs," Tyrion replied. He studied Jon with those sharp little eyes that had so often seen further than anyone light. "I told her also that she could trust you." Jon finally turned. "And can she?" "I believe you believe she can." Tyrion spread his hands at Jon's silence. "I am a broker of faith these days, and the rates are extortionate." Drogon's eyelids slid again. He stirred, perhaps to scratch an itch Jon could not see, or merely to remind the island that he was there, and nothing else mattered much. The sound was like leather dragged over rough stone. Jon had touched the dragon once, on the road across the reach, when the creature had lowered his head and allowed it, a thing so absurd and intimate that men had laughed afterward in disbelief. Drogon's skin had been warmer than a hearth's iron, the scales hard yet velvety, a paradox that had lodged in Jon's palm for hours. He did not know what any of it meant, except that the world seemed to be answering questions with creatures rather than words. "I will do what I can," Jon said. "I won't burn them." "Then the question is whether he will," Tyrion said quietly. And Jon knew he meant the dragon, and perhaps the man seated upon its heart as well. They walked down the slope together because there was nowhere else to walk. The sky was lifting from east to west, color seeping back into it, as if some unseen hand had brushed the world with watered ink. Men were stirring in the yard below, unsullied in unison. Grey Worm moving among them as precisely as a blade through cloth. Dothraki who rolled from blankets with single motions and checked their blades. Northern men rolling stiffly and frowning at the sea as if it had personally insulted their ancestors. Davos moved among them, quiet as he always was, saying little and seeing much. He caught Jon's eye, and something like a nod passed between them that had nothing to do with tactics and everything to do with a shared understanding of long odds. She stood on the stairs that curled from the great hall to the yard, light falling about her as if her hair had trapped it and would not let it go. Daenerys wore no crown. She had braided her hair herself, if the unevenness of the plaits meant anything, and they were too tight against her head, as if she wished pain. The color had leached from her cheeks. The hollows beneath her eyes were shadows. She looked like a woman sculpted from winter that had somehow learned to burn. "Your Grace," Tyrion said, bowing, and she did not nod or look away. She watched Jon with an attention that felt like weather. "They are ready," she said. Her voice was hoarse, threaded with something that was not quite exhaustion and not quite impatience. The wind caught her mantle and set it to snapping. "They will march when Drogon flies." Jon had heard men claim that dragons were only beasts. He had heard others claim that dragons were gods. Drogon turned his head slowly toward the sound of her voice and murmured something low and ascending, a sound like a mountain breathing. She came down the last steps and put her hand to his jaw. Her fingers were small against him. Her expression changed with a relief so naked it might have been grief's twin. Jon felt the tug at his chest that he had felt more and more, a pull in two directions. She looked at him again. "I want the gates opened. I want the scorpions burned. I want the bells rung." She swallowed. "Do that. Only that." He could not read if the tautness at her mouth was warning or promise. "I understand," he said. Her eyes were the color of the sea when the sun hid behind a cloud. "Do you?" she asked. And no one spoke for a long time. Tyrion shifted. Davos looked away. A gull cried as if knives had been hidden in its throat. "Let me fly him," Jon said. And the words surprised him, though they felt also as if he had been walking toward them for weeks. "Let me take him to the bay. I'll burn the ships. I'll burn the scorpions on the walls. I'll put the fear in them to open the gates, and when the bells ring, we'll hold." He had not known he would say "we." It seemed to have been waiting. Tyrion's head snapped toward him. "That is an unexpected suggestion." Daenerys did not blink. Her hand on the dragon's jaw tightened until her knuckles grayed. "He is mine." Jon did not look away. He could feel the dragon's heat even from where he stood. It stroked his skin like a fever. "I know, and they are your people, even if they don't know it yet. Let me keep them for you, if I can." He dared another step. Drogon's eye rolled toward him, slit narrowing, the thin membrane drifting. "He let me touch him," Jon said softly. "He may let me sit him." Silence again. The sort of silence that collects around stakes too high to name. Drogon's breath steamed. His maw parted slightly as if to taste this new notion. Tyrion seemed poised between prayer and laughter. Daenerys lowered her hand. She looked at Jon as if he were stone that might be a foundation or a weight that would drown her. When she spoke, her voice had gentled and grown brittle at the same time. "If you fall," she said, "there is no one to catch you. If I fall, I'll hope the sea is kind." He tried something like a smile and found nothing light enough to make one. "It never has been to me." For an instant, a fragile, strange instant, the corner of her mouth twitched, and not with disdain. She turned and looked into Drogon's eye. And whatever conversation passed between Queen and Dragon was not conducted in any language Jon knew. The dragon adjusted, a shifting that sent dust sliding and men stepping back without thought. "Mount him," Daenerys said. There were no words to wrap around the risk. Jon nodded, though he felt the motion more than he saw himself do it, and moved forward as one approaches a cliff he has already decided to leap from. The dragon's woven harness had been kept ready in this way and that. Leather strips tugged and retugged by unsullied hands, iron buckles polished with oil, the cinches checked and checked again. Jon smelled oiled leather, warm scale. Smoke that had sunk into hide so deeply it would never be washed away. He remembered the first mare he had sat at Winterfell, a shaggy brown thing that had decided, by some grace, not to throw him. Drogon was no horse. Drogon was a hill with a mind. Daenerys stood close enough that he could have brushed the sleeve of her arm with his fingers. He didn't. She took a breath. He responds to intention, she said, each word carefully placed, perhaps to keep herself from placing others. He feels it. Pull his left fore with your weight if you must, but do not yank the straps. Use your legs, your hips. He is not a boat. He is a wind with flesh. Jon nodded, and another memory hit him. Old Maester Luwin's voice telling him that sometimes the first lesson of any craft is that you will not master it today. The next breath he took was hot with the dragon's heat. He set his boot in the lower stirrup and hauled himself up. The scales under him were hard and slick and ridged, like a road paved with black coins. Then he was astride, the harness biting in the right places, his knees pressed against the living ridge of shoulder. Drogon's whole body hummed beneath him with contained violence. Jon reached forward and caught at the strap that looped beneath the thick neck. Daenerys stepped back. If her hands shook, he did not see it. She said something in the old tongue then. Softly, but with an edge the vowels could not hide, and Drogon's head rose. Jon had ridden in storms and in snow that peeled the breath from his lungs and left his beard rimed. He had ridden through ranks of dead with ice in their eyes. None of it prepared him for the instant Drogon leaped and the world fell away. His stomach lurched, and then his heart steadied. His hands clenched and then opened. The island was a toy, the men on it ants with spears, and the sea a skin stretched between continents. The wind hit him with hands of iron and salt, tore at his hair, found every seam in his cloak. He lowered himself to the living line of the dragon's back, and the air streamed over him like a river. Drogon climbed in a long, smooth arc, each beat of his wings a proclamation that gravity was only a suggestion. Jon felt the motion deep in his spine and thighs. It hurt and it thrilled. It was not like riding a horse over uneven ground. It was like riding a heartbeat. He leaned as the dragon leaned, testing that subtlety Daenerys had spoken of, shifting his weight the way you would with a temperate stallion. And Drogon responded, not with obedience, but with acknowledgement. Yes, you are there, the movement said. Keep up. They came out over the eastern shoulder of the island into a wash of light breaking under low clouds. The world's edge brightened to a blade. The first slur of sails could be seen to the south, ghostly triangles crowding together, then resolving into Euron Greyjoy's fleet, their black hulls biting the water, their cabins like eyes. On their decks, men looked up and froze. Jon felt, in the grit of Drogon's muscles, something like hunger sharpen. He did not think of Euron's grin, or the songs he made of his own name. He thought of a boy with a knife in his belly, and another boy burning on a river. He thought of the city's streets, which were narrow, foaming rivers of people who would choke if the fire took them. He thought of bells. He set his jaw and pressed his knees, and Drogon folded his wings the way a hawk does and dropped. The first volley of the scorpion bolts rose like a hedge of iron. Jon saw them because he was not Daenerys, because he was not only a dragon in the sky, because part of him was a Northman who had learned to count javelins in the dark. He had never flown before, yet his body made the choice before his mind had finished it. He put his weight to Drogon's right and let the strap slide in his left hand, and the dragon fell left like a river curling around a rock. The first line of bolts went into empty air. The next line came, and Drogon roared fire as if scorn had found flame. The first ship's scorpion tower blossomed into a torch. Men screamed and leaped, their armor catching as if some god had put his mouth to their backs and breathed. Jon kept Drogon moving. That was the thing. That was what mattered. In Winterfell's courtyards, the old men had taught boys to streak through arrow rain and not become a target by standing still. He made the dragon pass, and pass again. He did not linger to gloat over the ruin. He aimed the flame where it mattered. At the scorpions, at the ropes and pulleys and winches, at the tar. He could taste ash even aloft. He heard men yelling in tongues he did not know. He saw one of the enemy captains pull his crew to swing the great crossbow around in desperation. And Jon leaned hard and felt the dragon roll, and was grateful and was afraid. And then there was only flame again, thick as a cape around Drogon's head. They cleared the fleet in a wide arc that took them up, and then down, and then up again. Euron's flagship, grotesquely adorned with its wet smiling kraken, spewed black smoke from a split in its midships, where a scorpion stack had gone to splinters. Jon did not look to find a particular man on a particular deck. The sea would have him or not, and Jon had no time to feed hatred. The surviving ships, their sails flapping like wounded birds' wings, tacked clumsily to flee. Drogon rang the sky with his roar, and their courage went with the wind. The city came up under them, not as he had seen it before from a gate or a street, but as a living map. The red walls of the keep glimmered with an old arrogance. The sept was a scar of rubble-grown moss in its creases. A wound the city had taught itself to stop looking at. Roofs huddled together like conspirators. The walls along the narrow sea and the north road bristled with the scorpion frames the Lannisters had raised like altars to a new god who could smite dragons. Jon ticked them in his mind. Tower, tower, gatehouse, corner tatrot. Drogon's heat rolled up under him like breath from an oven. He started at the outermost towers, the ones nearest the sea. Drogon ate them with fire. The pitch of the screams changed in his ears. Men on the walls broke, some throwing down their pikes and leaping from parapets as if water had ever been mercy from flame. Jon kept them moving, sliding along the wall, burning only wood and iron, and the men who would not abandon their cranks. He did not dip low and spit flame into the city streets. He did not turn Drogon's head toward the market. His hands were steady where they gripped the strap. His legs burned where they clamped the great ribs. He spoke to the dragon, though he had no words for him. Not there. Here. Again. Hold. Dight. On the ground, the North and the Unsullied advanced. Jon saw them only intermittently. Flashes of patterns moving in the ant-narrowed streets, the glitter of spears massed in gray ranks, the ragged banners of the men of the Vale. He saw gray worms head bare and shining, moving like a knife through a crowd. He glimpsed the gold company outside the walls, a stiff, golden line that had thought to make history by keeping it out, and saw them break when the gate tower on their left blew apart as Drogon's breath torched the timbers binding its stones, and the eastern gate cracked like an eggshell. Jon took the dragon away from the gate then, climbed him up and out and over the city, so that the press of the armies could flood into the gap. He did not relish the thought of spears under Drogon's belly. He lanced 3 more scorpion towers, one after another, and a fourth whose crew had thought to hide behind a linen awning that caught like a held breath. Smoke began to smear the edges of the sky. Not thick yet. Not the choking blanket he had dreaded. Bells hung here and there, at the sept's broken circumference no longer, but at other chapels and watchposts. And when Jon skimmed low over a lane, he heard, impossibly, a child's cry of wonder and not fear. He had not expected that. It punctured him oddly. He took a breath of sulfur and old air, and brought Drogon up again where the scorpion bolts were thinner. On the steps of the Red Keep, men in red and gold hauled another scorpion frame into position, with ropes and swearing. Qyburn, that gaunt physician priest of death, stood behind them with his hands clasped, his little smile pretending benevolence. Drogon blurred toward them. Jon saw the speed. How it could become intoxication. How it could become the only thing. He cut the line with fire, and the frame went over backward, crushing 2 of the men pulling it. Qyburn leaped away with surprising grace for a man whose bones looked so tired. Drogon's wing beat sent a wave of heat that made banners along the keep's face sag. The Gold Company's banner toppled somewhere below, and the northern men cheered, a coarse, familiar sound that reached even Jon's strange high world with its flavors of home and hunger. The Dothraki poured through the shattered gate with the noise of hooves and the spill of black hair. The Unsullied went in with a discipline that refused chaos even as they stepped into it. Jon banked Drogon to follow the wall, to finish what he had promised, to break the last 2 scorpions near the mud gate. The besieged city made a sound like something tearing. It took him a moment to understand that the sound was bells. The first was cautious, as if someone were telling a story he did not believe. The second was louder, then another, different bells striking different notes, a tangle of bronze voices until the air itself seemed to shake with them. Jon almost forgot to hold with his knees. He found that he had been bracing against the moment of decision, as if it would come like a blow, and when it came as a ringing that lifted something from his chest. Drogon's head tilted slightly, perhaps to listen, perhaps to decide what music was. Jon slowed the dragon on his own breath, feeling for the motion with his hips, asking the creature to hover without yet falling. He had not known dragons could do that. Drogon could. The dragon shivered once, as if something moved through him that the man could not feel. And then he was steady. On the ground, a different shout went up, and Jon felt it rather than heard it. A change in temperature, a shift in menace, like a gust of cold wind passing through a warm room. Through a gap between 2 turrets, he saw the front ranks of Lannister soldiers begin to kneel, slowly, then all at once. Their spears clattered to the stones. Northmen and Unsullied faced one another across a few yards that suddenly seemed as wide as a valley. Many of the northern men lowered their swords. Grey Worm did not. Jon saw him as a bright, hard point in a tide of brown and gray. He turned Drogon's head with his hand and his thought. They drifted down. Men who had been very brave a heartbeat earlier cringed when the dragon's shadow fell across them. When Drogon landed, the stones shook, and some of the Lannister spears fell again as if prostrating on their own. Jon slid out of the harness with legs that felt made of old ropes. The world snapped back into its ordinary dimensions, and the smell of men, sweat, fear, piss, leather, smoke, blood beginning to think about drying, came to him with ugly intimacy. He put his hand flat to the dragon's shoulder without looking. He felt the great muscle twitch under his palm as if in warning. "Stay," he told some creature that might have been the dragon and might have been himself. Grey Worm faced him only when he had to, which was when Jon stepped in front of him. His eyes had gone further away into themselves than usual. He held his spear at an angle that said, "Attack and finish." "The bells are rung," Jon said. He wanted his voice to be the tone that calmed a spooked animal. He had done that before. "They killed her," Grey Worm said flatly. "They killed Missandei." He spoke the name as if it were a blade he had swallowed. "They did," Jon said. The words scraped. "Will this bring her back?" Grey Worm's mouth changed, a slight new tension. "It will make the world look like what it is." Women clutched children in the mouths of alleys. A Lannister soldier, not much older than a boy, knelt before Grey Worm, eyes shut as if he meant to die and wanted the darkness to come before the spear. Jon saw the choice rise like a spray of sparks in Grey Worm's eyes, the decision he had already made meeting the air to be breathed. Grey Worm's grip shifted. Jon moved. He did not grab the spear. He did not put his hand out as if to stay a friend. Grey Worm was not his friend. The man's loyalty was bound to another star, and he did not clench his fist as if to threaten. He said, "Hold," as if he had said it to a horse on a crumbling ridge with nothing but cloud below, as if he had said it to a child on a parapet, looking over winter. He put his body in the way. He was not sure what he would do if wood and iron came forward. He was not sure how much any of his life weighed. They stood like that while bells rang and men breathed. Grey Worm's nostrils flared. Something in his eyes shifted again, as if an oar had caught a different current beneath the surface. Then he turned his spear an inch and struck the stone at the boy's feet with the butt of it, and said something in his own language that made the front rank of Unsullied step back. "You will go to your men," Jon said, low. "Tell them to take the capitulation. Tell them to stand to. We will take the keep without burning it to the ground. If they fight from within, then we fight. If they yield, we take them." He could hear himself as if he were someone else speaking through him. He heard his father's voice and realized both men he meant were dead. Grey Worm looked past him, beyond him. Up. Jon followed the gaze. Drogon stood with his head lowered, mouth slightly open, strings of saliva like glass thread hanging from his blades of teeth. The dragon's eyes were narrowed to ink. Jon had the odd impulse to apologize to him for asking him to land among men who smelled of fear. He reached back and touched the dragon's shoulder again. He felt life there that nothing could argue with. "She is queen," Grey Worm said. If there was a question inside that, it was buried deep. "She is," Jon said. "And this is her city." Grey Worm's jaw ticked once. Then he stepped away and called in a voice that cut the street like a saw. The Unsullied flowed back the way water finds a lower place, without apparent hurry and with inexorable force. On the other side of the little square, northern men lowered their blades in a disorderly wave. Some begrudgingly, some gratefully. Davos shouldered his way through and gave Jon a look that mixed relief and exasperation, and a kind of cheer that had nothing to do with banners. "You've done something brave," Davos said under his breath when he reached him. "Or something foolish. Sometimes they ask the same coin at different tolls." "We're not dead yet," Jon said. He took another breath of smoke and bells. "Let's see what that buys." They advanced through streets that had become rivers of kneeling men, and weeping women, and stunned boys blinking, as if they had been wakened from a long dream into a short one. Jon kept Drogon with them, not too low, not too high. The dragon moved like an angry cloud above a little troop. The presence of him made men less brave and more wise. The bells went on. Twice they passed little chapels whose bells had seized into cracked disharmony from being struck so hard. So often, boys with ropes wound around their wrists heaved as if calling cattle or gods. Tyrion met them at a crossing that, in more peaceful days, would have been a market for cloth. The cloth had burned once before in this city. The ghosts of that heat lived in the mortar. Tyrion's hair curled damp to his head. Soot had laid a fingertip along one cheekbone. He looked both terrified and very alive. "The keep?" he asked, and the word was devoid of ornament. Jon nodded. "She will want the throne. She will want the woman who kept her from it. She will want a victory that looks like one," Tyrion said grimly, "and one that can be held afterward." He glanced up. "Seeing you there may work for some hearts as well as for their heads." He did not say whose hearts he meant. They went up the long way, because the short ways to power are always broken or barred. The flights of steps that led toward the rock, on which the keep had grown like scarlet fungus, were clogged with people who had nowhere to go and everything to fear. Jon's party worked through them, making lanes where none wished to open. Davos using his voice like a broom. Grey Worm's men making a wedge where knives would have made blood. The closer they drew, the less kneeling there was, and the more tight-mouthed resoluteness. Men and women who had lived all their lives in the shadow of power, and thought that shadow a shelter. Twice scorpion bolts came for them from windows, shot hastily, as if by men who had learned their weapons yesterday. Drogon's head swung and a fan of fire roasted the shutters and sent black smoke sliding along the stone. Jon hated the smell that rose then. The smell of burning oil, burning wool, and under it, something that clung to the back of his tongue like grief. He had promised himself he would not set the city alight. He had not promised that he would not make small fires where the choice was between a bolt and a blaze. He felt every one of those choices stick to him like burrs. At the foot of the last great stair they paused, and the pause was a thing with its own beating heart. The Red Keep's face lifted above them, windows like watching eyes, banners hanging still because the wind had gone. A line of Lannister soldiers blocked the bottom of the stair. A last real defense, by their set jaws and careful feet. They were not kneeling. They held shields interlaced, spears touching tips. Their captain raised his hand. "Parley," he said, a little too loud. Davos raised his. Parley. It was a word that had saved lives and justified murders. The captain licked his lips, his mustache catching a fleck of spit. "By the bells," he said, "we yield the stair. By the bells we lower our spears, but we ask safe conduct for." He hesitated, and Jon saw how even in surrender men arranged their fears. For the women and children within. Davos was opening his mouth when Grey Worm spoke, not loudly, but with something that cut. "The women and children will remain. Any man who chooses to lay down arms may live. Any man who chooses to pick them up will not." The captain's eyes flicked to the dragon hovering behind them. A crooked smile tugged his mouth and immediately fell away again as if it were a habit he had unlearned. "We will not keep you out." He raised his hand. The shields broke their neat pattern. The points of the spears dipped. Men breathed, some with relief, some as if breathing itself were capitulation. They went up into that redness then, up into corridors that had known more luxury than any place Jon had ever stood. The floors were polished with the fat of old feasts. The torch brackets were shaped like beasts eating each other. The tapestries hung as if they might whisper if you stood too long. He had been here once, under a different king. The memory made his stomach feel like water. He wondered whether history ever ended, or whether it only looped back upon itself like a snake losing its tail between its teeth. He could not take Drogon inside. The dragon clung to the outer wall, claws scraping slow arcs, moving along as a storm cloud will move, making sudden licks of flame when a window bristled with dangerous intention. The sound of him was a presence. Jon had thought that being aloft upon the dragon was the most alone he had ever been. He discovered that walking away from him was lonelier. Inside the keep, the air was thick enough to chew. There were people inside still. Servants, maids making little squeaks like mice, guards who had thrown away their livery and hoped their faces would become invisible. A woman in a brocade dress held a child with a smear of jam at the corner of his mouth, and Jon could not quite square that detail with anything else the room contained. Davos kept the soldiers moving with a patience that moved men faster than a whip. They reached the corridor that ran down to the throne room, and there the world paused again because the door was barred from within, and the men behind it had decided that the wood would hold, if they believed in it hard enough. The impact of the first ram shook dust from the ceiling. The second seemed to knock a note from the very bones of the rock. Jon wanted suddenly, without reason, to put his hand to the door and speak to it like a horse. "Easy now, let's not do this." But wood does not answer. He did not know she would be there until he saw her. She had set a little table in a little chamber off the main corridor, a place where lesser lords might have waited long hours to be called within, and she stood by it as if she had been placing cups for tea. Cersei Lannister wore red darker than the banners, as if she meant to outface the building. Her hair was short still, stubble at the nape of her neck, gold on the crown, regrowth making a kind of halo you did not wish to get near. She seemed both smaller and more dangerous dressed like that, like a blade that had been honed down until it was all edge. Qyburn stood behind her with his hands folded, eyes like two thumbprints pressed into wax. The mountain blocked the far side of the corridor, an eclipse in armor. She saw Jon and did not start. Of course she did not. Another Stark in a place he does not belong. She said lightly, almost kindly, a tone she might once have used to chide a son for tracking mud in. "Tell me, do you still have your wolf? They have a way of turning up where they're not invited." Then, Jon felt the slow creep of heat along his spine that he had learned meant anger and tried to be ashamed of. He felt Drogon's weight outside the wall, like a second shadow he now carried everywhere. He thought of all the people between the gates and this red room, all the breath still being taken, because he had kept the dragon to his leash. "Your people have rung the bells," he said. "You will yield, and you will come with us. There need not be more blood." "And now?" She smiled, and he saw grief like a healed fracture in the corner of her mouth. Perhaps for her children, perhaps for herself, perhaps for the idea that she had once been invincible. There need always be more blood. She said, matter of fact, like a woman who had kept books. "If not yours, then mine. If not mine, then some man's whose name you do not know, and who will not be sung in any hall. Do not insult me by pretending anything else." The door behind Jon shuddered again. Wood creaked as if some patient tree were considering bending. Jon kept his eyes on hers. "It can be yours," he said. "It does not have to be theirs." He did not mention Daenerys. He did not say your queen. The air here was too thin for titles. Qyburn's mouth moved as if he had tasted something sour. "My queen," he murmured. "I advise we take the lower ways. There are passages within the rock that—" "The lower ways lead to the shore," Cersei said without looking at him. "And what waits on the shore, Qyburn?" The little smile again. "A dragon." "I have had enough of dragons for this lifetime." She set her hands on the edge of the table. The ring on her left hand had a lion with a ruby in its mouth. The gem looked like a clot. Then, "Surrender," Jon said. "And if I do?" Her eyes went to his face like a blade searching for a notch. "A foreign queen sits my father's chair. The streets fill with men whose language I do not care to learn. My head goes in a basket, or it does not, and millions of mouths chew the tail." "Your head will not," Jon said before he had entirely decided it. He could feel Tyrion bristle beside him like a dog that has heard a whistle he cannot ignore. "You will stand trial." "You will—" Cersei laughed then. A little laugh. A laugh that made something old and tired in him harden. "A trial? By whom?" "By those whose city you burn. By the boy who dreams he is a crow. Do you think I have not seen men in rooms like this invent a trial because the person before them must die, and they love a story to make it comfortable?" She tilted her head. "Tell me, Stark, do you think because you fly a dragon today that you are not a man like any other?" The ram struck again. The bar on the great door split. Jon did not turn. "I know what I am," he said. His voice sounded to him like one of the bells now. Steady, an iron thing hit with intent. "And I know what I am not." He took a breath. "Come. If you will not come, we will come through you." She regarded him a heartbeat longer, eyes moving on his face as if she were memorizing a map that might, one day when she had nothing else, comfort her. "You are very sure," she said finally. And something in her softened just for a moment. Something that made her look like the girl she had been when her hair had been long and the world had seemed simple. It vanished. She turned to the mountain and lifted her chin. "Stay," she said to the thing that had once been a man. To Qyburn she said, "You will live long enough to see whether your curiosities survive a changing tide." Then she walked toward Jon. He stepped aside because if he had put his hand on her, he was not sure whether he would bring her or throttle her. She moved past him with the grace of someone who had been taught to move before men from the moment she could walk. Tyrion swayed as if struck, but the blow had been long coming, and he'd been braced for it. Davos gestured, and the soldiers arranged themselves around her with that careful respect that men use when they escort something more dangerous than a prisoner, a symbol they have not yet decided to insult. The great door cracked inward with a final sound, and the throne room lay revealed, and it was not what Jon expected. He had thought of the Iron Throne as a dragon's spine, as storybooks always had it, as the thing he had seen far away, as a boy, huge, glittering, terrible. It was terrible, yes, but up close it had a shabbiness. The edges of some swords going soft, rust gnawing here and there where some steward had not been as diligent as he should. The stone around it stained with the slow bleeding of metal into dust. It looked less like a promise than like a question no one had answered in 100 years. Daenerys stood not upon it but before it. She had come up another way then with her guard and her precision. Her hair lay across her back in the tight braids she had tied with her own hands. Her face was white as paper. Drogon's shadow crossed the high windows and crossed again. When she saw Cersei between northern men, something in her went even stiller, which Jon would not have thought possible. "My queen," Tyrion said softly, but he might as well have spoken to winter. Daenerys looked at Cersei and then at Jon. In his chest, something shifted, an old fault line grating. She drew a breath that hurt to hear. "You surrendered," she said to Cersei, and the clarity of the words was like glass. "I did," Cersei said. "I have had practice at losing what is mine." Daenerys blinked one slow blink. "You will be kept under guard. You will be tried." Cersei's smile was a wound. "By whom?" "By the people," Daenerys said. And there was a tremor of something. Not uncertainty, but outrage held on a leash. "By the world you thought you owned." She looked at Jon again for a long breath, and said nothing he would have known how to answer. She turned to the throne and the space before it, at the light falling across the spilled swords. "Leave us," she said. Tyrion's head twitched. "Your Grace?" "Leave us," she repeated, and her voice did not rise. It did not need to. The soldiers looked to their captains. The captains looked to the advisors. Davos looked at Jon as if to ask whether they would allow this. Jon looked at Drogon's shadow on the floor, and then at Daenerys' face. The last time he had defied a queen, he had died for it. He was not sure he would do it differently again. "Stay with her," he said to Grey Worm, indicating Cersei with a short nod. To Davos. "With me." He did not look at Tyrion because that would have been too much like asking a man whether he wished his heart to break in public. He walked toward the high windows where the light made long pillars, and he felt Daenerys' attention on his back like heat. The room emptied in that slow, reluctant way that rooms with too much importance do. The doors closed. The bells outside continued, as if now that they had begun, they did not know how to stop. They were not alone. Not properly. Servants moved noiseless as gilt along the peripheries, and at the far end, a handful unsullied stood like statues. But they might as well have been alone, because the space between the two of them had become a country with its own climate and rules. "You flew him," she said. Not accusation, not marvel. A statement like a scar. "I flew him," Jon said. He felt the truth of it still in his legs. "You burned the scorpions. You broke the fleets. You left the streets." Her eye drifted, beyond him, perhaps to a lane where a woman held a baby under a window, from which no fire fell. "You left them." "I left them," he echoed. He tried to find a way to tell her that he had done it because of her, and found he could not find the entrance to that sentence. The bells, she cut across him, and he flinched because for a moment he thought she would break the word into pieces with her teeth. She swallowed. They rang. She took a step toward the throne and stopped again. "I did not think they would ring for me." "They rang for surrender," Jon said. "They rang for something not Cersei." Daenerys' mouth moved slowly, as if tasting bitterness. She looked at the throne one more time, then turned and faced him fully. "Do you know what it is to be kept from the thing that you know is yours?" Her voice seemed tired of edges. "Do you know what it is to want to tear the world open just to see whether your name is written on its heart?" "Yes," Jon said before he could decide not to. Something in her eyes changed then, not softened but sharpened. "And you chose not to," she said. "You sat upon the world's fire and you did not burn it out." "I did," he agreed quietly. Today, they stood with the throne between them, like a third person listening. Outside, the dragon slid along the wall. His sound entered the room like weather. "We cannot share this," Daenerys said at last. And now there was the thing he had been trying not to hear. The city, the throne, the love of the people. They will choose. They will look up and see one of us on a dragon, and make their word for that sight. She looked at him so desperately then that he wanted to look away, to give her back her dignity. "I have lost so much." "So have I," he said softly. "Yours made you loved," she whispered. "Mine made me feared." He wanted to say that neither of those things had a single cause, that fate and choice and accident and the cruelty of men had made equal meals of both of them. He wanted to tell her that love had left him dead on a table once, and fear had kept him alive beyond the wall more often than pride. He could not find a way to put any of it into words that would not sound like a sermon. He did the one thing he could do. He stepped nearer. "We don't have to decide it now," he said. "We have men in the streets with their swords half up and half down. We have a queen in our custody who, if she is not handled, will be a story that outlives either of us. We have food to find and the sick to tend and dead to bury. Let the city breathe. Then talk. I am tired." She said, and the words were so ordinary that he felt something twist in him like a rope. "I am so tired, Jon. Every step I have taken has been up a hill I did not make." She closed her eyes briefly. Sometimes the only way to rest is to set the hill on fire. He thought of a hill by Winterfell, where the boys had slid on old shields, when the snow crusted and the sun made the ice sing. He thought of valleys where the wind ran free, because nothing taller than grass stood to break it. "If you burn it," he said, "you will have to keep walking, because there will be nothing left beneath your feet." They looked at each other in that clean, narrow space between choices. The sound of bells fell away in his ears. He heard instead the crackle of coals in a hearth that had kept a castle alive through too many winter nights to count. She looked at the throne not as a thing to be claimed, but as a thing she had always been walking toward. And he understood then that sometimes the thing you walk toward shapes you more than the place you came from. The door at the far end burst inward, and everything sudden and inevitable returned. Grey Worm strode in, and with him came the smell of blood and cold air from a corridor where people had stopped breathing. Behind him, as if attached by a cord, came the Hound, his face more ruined than man, and Arya Stark, her hair matted to her skull, her eyes so full of purpose that Jon felt the ground tilt. Between them, dragging the world like ballast, came the Mountain, untouched by knives and unmoved by men. And at the end of that grim procession, like a piece of flotsam on a flood, stumbled Jaime Lannister with one hand, his face so open with grief that even Grey Worm's mouth tightened with something not hatred. The room changed shape. Stories piled on stories. Jon's breath sat in his chest like a stone, and then it moved because it must. "Not here," he heard himself say, and it was not command so much as plea. "Not in this room." But no room belongs to the men standing in it. The shape of fate had always been that it dragged them. The best any of them did was fall with purpose. The Hound's eyes found the Mountain, and there was nothing left in them for any other thing. Arya's eyes found Cersei, and there was a space there where anything could happen. Jaime's eyes found Cersei as well, and in his, for the first time in a long time, something like honor had come home late and trembling and astonished to still be alive. Grey Worm's eyes found Jon, and there was the old question there. Who decides the world? Daenerys' hand curled in and unclenched, a little gesture of a little girl told once too often that she could not have something and had learned to take it with fire. Drogon's shadow passed across the floor one more time and hung there like a question thickened into substance. "Take the Lannister queen," Daenerys said at last, and her voice was very quiet. "Bring her below. Guard her. No one touches her without my leave." She looked at Jaime, and whatever she saw there made her mouth draw. "He goes with her. Let them sit with what they made." Grey Worm moved. The Unsullied moved with him in that precise ripple. A sheet cut cleanly with a good pair of shears. The Mountain did not move. The Hound took a step forward, and a second, and then the second step became a charge. Arya moved at the same moment, like a blade sliding from a sheath. But Deva's hand caught her upper arm, and held with the strength of a man who had hauled lines in storms and saved men by not letting go. "Not you," he whispered. Not a command, but a prayer. She turned on him a face that could have been Winter's daughter and did not pull herself free. She leaned instead as if rooted to the spot he had defended. The Mountain lifted his sword and the room exhaled, and the world that had for a few breaths balanced on the choice of mercy returned to the old balance where steel decides. Jon stepped because you step. He had only Ghost's name in his mouth and nothing to do with it. Grey Worm stepped as well, and Drogon, sensing motion, flared flame across a far window as if punctuating a sentence none of them had said aloud. Clegane and Clegane met like avalanche and cliff. The first blow threw sparks in a white shower. The second made a sound like a cathedral falling. The Hound's breath came in a groan that might have been relief. The Mountain's breath did not come at all. They fought the way storms fight. No tactic, only inevitability. Qyburn tried to say something and died between them like a twig under a wheel, and in the sound that made Cersei flinched for the first time since Jon had seen her. She looked suddenly very small, and Jaime, whose face was a ruin of love, went to her as if his bones had known the way all his life. Daenerys did not move. Jon looked at her, then at the throne, then at the fighting men, then at the dragon shadow, then at Arya's eyes. He felt in his knees the animal readiness to leap, and knew it was not a horse's leap he was being asked for. "Keep him to the light," Davos said under his breath, and Jon realized he meant the Hound. He meant anyone you wished to save. He moved then, dragging Grey Worm with him a half pace. Pulling the angle, turning the fight so that the mountain's back was to the taller windows where the bright day still lay. The Hound, who had hated everything bright, moved into it like a man who chooses the manner of his death. The mountain's sword cut a pillar. Stone dust shook into the light in a glitter that might have been snow if snow stank of iron. The fight rolled. The world held its breath. Cersei and Jaime slid away along the wall, like two shadows trying to find the seam by which walls meet floors. And for once no one stopped them because the rune's attention had been taken like a bird by a snake. Arya's face shifted as Davos' hand held her, and Jon saw there a terrible patience. A woman's patience, the kind that outlasts kingdoms. It ended, quickly and painfully. And as it must when a man who is more story than flesh has his eyes opened by thumbs that have learned that trick before. The mountain fell with a sound like armor thrown down a well. The Hound staggered, laughed a broken laugh, and put his knife one last time where it would matter. He looked up then, and in his eyes as they met Jon's, there was peace so shocking that Jon almost flinched. "Fire," the Hound whispered. Not in fear now, not like a child in a stable, but like a man remarking on weather, and in a little while he went to it on his own feet. Silence when it comes after that sort of noise is the most terrible silence of all. It came. The bells thought about ringing again and decided not to. The dust settled. A small spider crawled from a crack in the stone to a crack in a sword and did not know history. Cersei and Jaime were gone. Daenerys watched the empty space with a stillness that made Jon think of the moment just before a hawk stoops. He stepped toward her without deciding to. He did not touch her. "We can still end it," he said. And he meant not only this day, but the way this day would be told when their bones were dust. "We can bring them out into the square. We can speak to the people. Bells have rung. We can make that stand for something that lasts longer than one afternoon. Then, oh, you will stand with me," she said. And it was not a question, but a condition. Her eyes, gray now under this light, searched his. "You will stand, and they will see the dragon and the wolf together, and they will make a new word. Or you will not, and they will make an old one." He thought of the sticky jam at the child's mouth. He thought of Grey Worm's spear butt thudding the stones beside a boy's foot instead of the boy's ribs. He thought of Tyrion's little face, etching itself each hour with new lines that were roads only a few men ever walk and fewer return by. He thought of a chair made of splintered swords that ached for a back to cut, and a story about how cutting made a king. "I will stand," Jon said. It was the easiest vow he had spoken in years, and the hardest. He said it knowing nothing about tomorrow and everything about himself. He said it while Drogon moved along the wall outside to a new position, because even dragons do not hold one place forever. He said it, and felt, for the first time that day, the weight of the sword at his hip, as if it were not merely iron, but a promise he had been postponing since the day a man in a black cloak had laid it in his hand. They came down from the throne room into a day that had decided, finally, to be bright. Blue took back the sky from smoke one measured inch at a time. The smell of burning became only the memory of it. Men's voices resumed the ordinary business of being alive. Commerce in whispers, curses over small injuries, a mother's quick song to remind a child that the world contained more than fear. They walked out into the square before the steps and made a place there because they were the ones who could. Cersei stood beside Grey Worm with her back straight and her face empty, and Jaime stood at her shoulder with his ruin of love and a steadiness that made Jon think that honor sometimes learned to walk on one leg. Tyrion stood to Daenerys' left, a little behind, as if position could also be penance. Davos stood to Jon's right because that was how ships are kept off rocks. Arya stood further in shadow, her mouth a line that might become anything. Drogon came lower, then, and his shadow laid itself across them, not like threat, but like a roof. The square took breath together. Jon waited for Daenerys to speak, and told himself he was not holding his own breath. "My people," she began. And the words were not in the language the city spoke, but like any weather. People learn quickly what it means. Tyrion spoke it after her, and the sense of it went through the crowd like the warmth of sunlight when it finds you after cold. "You have rung the bells." She nodded once, a little concession, in front of a world. You have laid down your arms. You have allowed me not to burn you. It was almost a joke, and not one at all. Now we will begin again. There will be justice. There will be bread. There will be those among you who wish to rise, and will do so. There will be those who wish to return to their old ways, and find that they cannot. She looked at Cersei, and something passed over her face like a cloud. There will be a reckoning for those who built their lives on the pain of others. Jon listened to the words and tried to feel which way the wind went between them and the crowd. He felt fear loosening in little knots. He felt the slow filament of hope, trying to string itself from one set of ribs to another. He felt hatred waiting because hatred always waits. It does not tire easily. And there will be a choice, Daenerys said. And this was not part of any speech he had heard Tyrion murmur in draft before. There will be a choice of who stands where I stand and says these words in your language. There are three kinds of inheritance: that of blood, that of will, that of deed. I have one kind. Others have others. She turned her head then and looked at Jon, and the crowd followed her eyes like iron following a lodestone. This is Jon of House Stark, she said, and then after a little beat that felt like a door opening or closing, and of House Targaryen. He burned the scorpions. He spared your streets. He is not a man of many words. He is not a man who loves the crowd, which makes him less dangerous to a crowd than many kings I have known. Menatranal. Jon felt his blood in his face, as if it were cold wine poured there. He stood because he had promised to stand, and because the choice to sit had been taken from him when he had first put his hands on a dragon's warm neck. He did not look at Tyrion. He looked at the people who looked at him, and saw in some of them a new hunger, and in others a new mercy, and in many not much at all beyond the simple, sweet wish to live long enough to forget today. He stepped forward and lifted his voice, and it did not carry like hers did because he had never practiced. But men are good at listening for sincerity, because so few people bother to try it. I don't want a throne, he said. He meant it in his bones. I want a city that does not fear the fire. I want children who grow up thinking bells mean weddings and harvests, not surrender. I want the men who serve to do so because the work makes them proud, and not because a man will beat them if they don't. I want justice that is slower than anger and longer than one day. He looked at Cersei and then at the people again. We will make a trial. We will do it before you, and we will live with what it says. Someone cheered because crowds always have someone willing to start. The cheer did not swell into madness. It moved like a cautious animal that has decided to approach a hand. People looked at one another the way people do when they realize they are the crowd, and the crowd is them. For a little while, time sat where they had placed it. When it moved again, it did so slowly. The soldiers set about the long business of collecting blades and burying the men they now had the luxury to be sad for. The kitchens of the keep opened like reluctant flowers, and sent forth bread with the flour still pale on its crusts. Tyrion found a corner where he sat and spoke to his hands for a while, then got up and went to find paper upon which to write the rules that make trials look like justice. Davos commandeered carts and women and boys who could add and began to build a ledger of the living that did not include the dead. Grey Worm went among his men and set his sorrow to an order that would not compromise it. Drogon found a high roof that his claws could grip without knocking it down and went to sleep with one eye thinly open. Jon walked the edge where shadow and light met on the stone and tried to fit himself in. He had flown and burned and landed and spoken and stood. He felt as if he had been 10 men in a single day and none of them fully himself. He turned a corner and found Arya leaning against a pillar. Her arms crossed, her face thoughtful and not kind and not unkind. You were going to kill her, he said. I still might, Arya replied. The words were not angry. But I can wait. He nodded. He died as he wanted, he said, and they both knew which he meant. He died as he knew he would. She said, There's a difference. She looked at him then, long and without flinching. You changed a story today. He thought of the many he had not changed, the knots he had cut with swords because he had lacked patience or imagination. "For now," he said. "For now." She echoed, and walked away, moving like a story herself. Night crept in, crimson slipping to purple, smoke cooling to ghost. The bells slept. The city's breathing settled. From the bay came only small sounds: ropes creaking, water slapping timbers, a man coughing into his hand to see whether his lungs still worked after a day of smoke. Jon stood at the top of a tower for a long time because height felt honest. Drogon came to stand beside him, as much beside as a creature so vast can be. And when Jon put his hand on that heated hide, it felt less like touching a beast and more like touching a piece of the world that had agreed, for the moment, to hold still. He looked down at the red maze and thought of a throne that did not fit anyone without scarring him. He thought of Daenerys in some chamber lit by a single lamp, unbraiding her hair with hands that had done so much killing and so much saving that sometimes he could not tell where one ended and the other began. He thought of a trial that would cut a queen, and a people who might forgive or might not, and an army that had learned to live on orders. He thought of the way the dragon had felt under him, alive and dangerous and willing. He thought of the word "we" and knew that this was the beginning of its hardest meaning. When he slept, finally, it was in a chair beneath a window with a hiss of tide for lullaby. He dreamed of Winterfell, and the smell of pine, and a black wolf's breath on his face that did not sting like sulfur. He dreamed of a hall full of men whose laughter he could not understand, and a woman in a red dress humming a song a long way away. He dreamed of a throne made not of swords but of wood worn smooth by hands that had used it without worship. He woke before dawn to a sky just beginning to think about light, and there was a knock at his door. Not afraid, not urgent, just steady. He rose, and his knees complained, and his sword at his hip swayed like a weight that had remembered it was there. He opened the door and found Tyrion with a parchment in his hand, and a look on his face that said the world had, during the night, become a more complicated story, and that he had fallen in love with the complication because he would. "Good morning," Tyrion said. "If it is that, I have a list of names and a plan to make those names face the world. And I have a question I am very much afraid to ask, because once I have asked it, the answer will live in my head like a tenant who forgets to pay the rent." "Now," Jon rubbed at his eyes. "Ask. Do you want a crown?" Tyrion asked, softly. "Not the story we will tell the people today or tomorrow. Not the part of you that knows what you should say in any square. The part of you that flew a dragon and did not burn. The part of you who knows your name. Do you want a crown?" "Then no." Jon thought of the little boy inside him who had wanted a father to say he had done well. The young man who had wanted a girl to promise him that a bed in the snow could be warm. The dead man who had wanted only to stop being cold. He thought of the dragon's warmth and the people's eyes and the throne's edges. He thought of Daenerys' face when she had said, "We cannot share this." "No," he said, and in the saying he felt the shape of a yes that would never be spoken. He looked beyond Tyrion toward the not yet dawn. "But wanting isn't the only thing that decides what we carry. That is the problem with crowns," Tyrion said mildly. "They weigh the same whether you desired them or not." He lifted the parchment. "Breakfast of a sort. Justice bled and made into ink. Will you join me?" Jon took the parchment because that had become a portion of his work, taking things from men who were smaller and sharper and gentler than he, and trying not to break what they offered him. He nodded. He stepped out into the corridor where the day would begin again. Drogon shifted on his roof and blew out a breath that drifted over the keep like a warning or a blessing. And in the city below, a child woke and discovered that the bells were silent, and the sky was not. And far away, in a room where things had been arranged according to an old idea of power, a woman with hair like a pale flame had decided whether the word we would break or hold. He did not know which. He only knew that the world had not ended after all, which is always worse, and always better, and always the same beginning. He went to meet whatever waited with ink and old bread, and a friend who drank too much water now instead of wine. He went because that is what men do when dragons sleep and look like hills and bells are quiet, and someone has to say the first word of the day that is not surrender. He went with the weight of the sky still on his legs, and the warmth of a creature's breath still on his hands, and the sound of a sister's steps in the corridor, light as knives and certain as dawn. He went, and the narrow space between what had happened and what would happen next opened its mouth to take him in.